Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome on behalf of Eurosac and CEPI Eurokraft to our webinar From Policy to Practice, Ensuring PPWR Compliance. I'm very pleased to have you with us today for an hour packed with insights into one of the most important regulatory transitions our industry has faced in years. As you all know, the new Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation introduces far-reaching requirements covering the entire packaging life cycle. It will apply across all EU member states as of summer 2026, which means the clock is ticking for producers, converters, and recyclers alike. Today's webinar aims to answer a central question: how do we move from policy to real-world implementation confidently, safely, and in full compliance? So to tackle this, we have invited three leading experts covering the regulatory, food contact safety, and recyclability dimensions of the PPWR. So here's what you can expect today. Our first speaker will be Annick Carportier, Director General of EPPA and Co-Chair of Fiber Packaging Europe. She will provide an update on the PPWR, including secondary legislation, and explain what these changes mean for the PPWR value chain. She will be followed by Susanna Anderson, Project Manager and Regulatory Specialist at NormPack, and she will provide insights into food contact safety, discuss the evolving regulatory landscape around substances of concern, and share the latest developments on upcoming EU-wide analytical methodologies. And last but not least, we will have Martina Friedl, LCA expert at RISE, and she will present the updated design for recyclability guidelines, highlight the newest recyclability assessment results, and offer an overview of collection and recycling initiatives in Europe, such as Construction Goes Circular. Each presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, and we invite you, of course, to actively participate and share your questions with us. To do so, you can simply submit your questions in the Q&A box right below the presentation window at any time during the presentations. If you're watching the presentation in full screen mode, you will need to minimize the window to access the Q&A function. And your questions will go directly to me, so they won't be visible to the public, and we will address all questions at the end of each presentation. And in case we run out of time, don't worry, your question isn't answered, you can, of course, email us your question at info@eurosac.org, and we will be happy to follow up with you afterwards. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for streaming on eurosac.org in the coming days. So with that, let's dive right in. So our first speaker today, as I said, is Annick Carportier. Annick has a long-standing and highly respected track record in EU sustainability, environmental policy, and packaging legislation. And in addition to her role as Director General of the European Paper Packaging Alliance, she serves as co-chair of Fiber Packaging Europe, an informal coalition of 7 trade associations spanning forestry, pulp, paper, board, and carton production and recycling. And together they work to advance renewable, circular, and sustainable fiber-based packaging solutions that support the objectives of the European Green Deal. Annick holds academic degrees in environmental management and political science, and today she will provide a timely update on the PPWR, including the rapidly evolving secondary legislation that will define what exactly is required from summer 2026 onwards. Annick, we're delighted to have you with us today, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ingo, and good morning to all. I'm delighted to be with you today to give you a bit of an overview of the very complex piece of regulation, which is packaging waste regulation. Complex indeed, long, tedious, but also very far-reaching, as has been said. It's, as I'm mentioned, or as already mentioned, the piece of regulation was adopted in 2024 and will enter into force on the 12th of August 2026. That is basically in 6 months. or whether several of the requirements apply across different timelines. Main requirements will be enforced in 2030, but also some will be applicable a bit later. It is a regulation. What does it mean? So far, most environmental laws at EU level were directives, which meant that they were addressed to member states, which were then to implement and kind of encompass those directives into their own national legislative body. Now, with a piece of regulation that applies directly across the EU member states to all economic operators in the Union. And as a matter of fact, another quite interesting difference with the past pieces of legislation is that most of the requirements actually apply to economic operators and not to member states. Some of them apply to member states. Another interesting aspect of a regulation is, of course, the fact that it is meant to have a harmonized approach and requirements across the Union. Yet some freedom of action has been left to the member states, whereby they can, for some aspects, divert from the harmonized requirements. As mentioned, this piece of regulation is complex, but it will also be clarified to some respect, and also, let's say, made clearer and more precise and more detailed through some 50 delegated and implementing acts, which will really provide the granular rules. And some of them are in the making, some of them will still be developed in the coming years. Mentioned by Ingo as well, this will impact and is actually already impacting virtually every sector of the economy, because every sector of the economy uses packaging, either transport packaging, service packaging, or sales packaging. Some of the provisions are still a bit unclear, and therefore the Commission will issue a notice document, which is the equivalent of a guideline, or in other words, a legal interpretation of some of the unclear provisions. However, this document that will be published in the official journal after inter-service consultation will not be legally binding per se, as only the Court of Justice has the power to really provide the final legal interpretation. As you may have heard in the last months, and partly because of the unclarities of some of the provisions, some sectors and stakeholders have called for the Commission to reopen PPWR. Now, there was an opportunity with the omnibus, the environmental omnibus published a couple of days ago, but the Commission will not reopen PPWR. That's what we know so far. This I will not explain. This is really a bit of a busy slide. It's not even exhaustive. It just gives you an idea of some of the deadlines and the implications of the deadlines over the coming years. So I will leave it to you to dig into that, and I want to have a note here as well. What I will present, and I suppose also any speaker, will only be a zoom in on some of the parts of the PPWR. For full legal clarity and certainty, I of course would advise that you look at the legal text. So, zooming in on one of the first articles, which is the key definition that are provided in Article 3. And I will again zoom in on some of them, which is namely a producer, supplier, manufacturer, and making available on the market. The definitions are rather complex, long, sometimes unclear, despite the fact that we read them a number of times. And what is also maybe a bit surprising to some point is that the European Commission aims to have a different definition of the different definitions, especially manufacturer, as depending on the type of packaging and for different articles. For example, Article 5.5, which sets the limits for PFAS to be found in packaging. Fiber Packaging Europe, which has been mentioned, which is this coalition of 7 associations, has advocated a position in favor and in support of a consistent definition of the manufacturer across the different articles for regulatory certainty and predictability, but also, of course, as you can imagine, for clarity as to who pays the EPR fees, because that is really this definition and how you interpret it will really define who pays the fees. Now, again, zooming in, the recyclability of packaging is one of the key objectives of that piece of regulation. And that objective was actually adopted at the highest political level a few years ago. A few years ago, the Commission adopted the objective that by 2030, all packaging would be recyclable and or reusable. And this revision of the PPWD, which is now called PPWR, is actually mainly focusing on this recyclability and reusability. Now, you see, this slide is also rather busy. Now, there's much more to it if you read Article 6 of the PPWR. But in essence, what is to be retained is that by 2030, all packaging will need to be recyclable. And that will be assessed based on compliance with the Design for Recycling guidelines, which are being developed at the level of CEN. So there's been a Commission mandate to CEN to develop the Design for Recycling guideline. This should be finalized in the course of next year, but rather Q1 or maybe a bit into Q2. But also, packaging will need to be compliant with performance grades. Basically, that means recyclability performance grades, whereby A is 90%, B is 80%, and C is 70%. And by 2030, packaging will need to be recyclable minimum at 70%. It is not yet clear how that assessment of recyclability performance grade will be defined, as the Commission, and actually more specifically the Joint Research Center of the Commission, will define the methodology to assess the performance grade. Member states will or shall modulate EPR fees based on those performance grades. So this is quite critical, of course, as we know that the EPR fees can in some cases really be very high. By 2035, all packaging will need to be recycled at scale. What does that mean? Actually, again, there the Commission will develop clarification in a secondary legislation as to the methodology to define the recycle at scale. But in essence, what we understand from the Commission is that this will mean effective recycling. Effective recycling based on the 2019 methodology for the calculation of the recycling rate. So it's basically focusing on everything which is recycled and deducting the non-targeted materials and the contaminants and the humidity above natural humidity. 2038, packaging will need to be recyclable at 80%. So again, there's uncertainty as to the methodology, but that is the objective. Now, the two categories that you can see on that slide are rather important, because the first one is really what is the categories which are provided by the PPWR with regard to the recyclability assessment. And you can see there that there is a specific category for LPB, so liquid packaging board, beverage cartons, in other words, cups, trays, plates, and cups, metallized or plastic laminated paper cardboard with plastic liners and windows. Whereas for the recycle at scale, which is 55% by 2035, there are actually only two categories, which means that sacks will actually be part of the paper cardboard category, except liquid packaging board, which is a specific category on its own. This is important because if we speak about effective recycling, we know that the paper sector is best in class. According to Eurostat, in 2024, paper packaging was recycled at a rate of 87%, which is extraordinary if you think about how consumers behave. All of us, including myself, we are not always sorting packaging exactly the way we should. And so 87% for packaging, paper-based packaging is extraordinary. And in that sense, we will, in any case, all be, liable with the 55% recycle at scale target. So this is quite important now for the recyclability. There is a more granular approach in the design for recycling guideline and expectedly as well in terms of performance grades. Zooming in on another part of the PPWR, that's the recycled content. There's a mandatory recycled content target by 2030 of 10% of non-PET contact-sensitive packaging, and that is actually indeed for contact-sensitive packaging. So 10% of the plastic part of the packaging, which means that if you have a packaging with 10% plastic and the rest is paper or board, then in that case, the 10% plastic will need to include 10% recycled plastic. And the objective for 2030 is 25% of recycled plastic of non-PET contact-sensitive packaging. Now, stakeholders and industry flagged to the Commission the risk of non-availability of recycled plastic for food contact material by the time the requirement comes into place. Indeed, there is number one competition for the recycled material, especially for food contact, not only in the packaging world, but also from textile or automobile, etc. Number two, as we know, there is also high competition between virgin and recycled plastic, whereby at the moment, the recycled plastic industry is not doing so well, with some recyclers closing doors. Which means that there is a question mark as to the availability of that recycled plastic. The Commission has heard the arguments and therefore will review the availability of the technology and the material so that if it is not available, the targets can potentially be adjusted. Now, as a takeaway, you can see that there's also an exemption, quite interesting exemption indeed, for contact-sensitive packaging when there is a risk for human health or let's say, yes, human health, which could actually lead to non-compliance with the target. And important to note as well, any plastic part representing less than 5% of the total weight of the whole packaging unit is not considered for that recycled content target. That is pretty much in line with the Article 3.24, which defines composite packaging, and with a threshold of indeed 5%. So as I said, sacks will need to have 10% recycled content plastic by 2030 and 25% by 2040. The Commission in 2028 will assess the availability of that material. It's only post-consumer plastic and only the plastic part of the packaging is considered. Another interesting article is Article 10, which is about packaging minimization, which initially really targeted the e-commerce packaging and the boxes, etc. But as a result, the provisions actually apply to all kind of packaging, and there is, in essence, a requirement to minimize the size of packaging to the needed size, I would say. By 2030, the manufacturer or importer shall ensure that the packaging placed on the market is designed so that its weight and volume is reduced to the minimum necessary to ensure its functionality, taking account of the shape and material from which the packaging is made. So that could be actually an opportunity for the sack sector, as there is already a very high efficiency in terms of ratio, weight that can be carried, and the packaging itself. So I see that I need to move on a little bit. So I will go a bit further, a bit quicker now. Transport packaging is of course critical. There are targets which are in place for 2030 and 2040, as you can see. There was also a target set for, and there is a target set for the entry into force, that is August 2026. With 100% recycling for the transport packaging for specific relation within the companies, within the same member states, etc. I will leave it to you in view of time to read that in more details. But there is some good news as well, in the sense that the Commission will adopt a delegated act which will exempt pallet wrappings and straps used for stabilizing goods from the 100% reuse target, which was provided in Article 29.1 and 29.2 and 3. However, the 40% target in 29.1 remains in place because the Commission considers that that is feasible. Also note please that this applies exclusively to the specified formats mentioned under transport packaging and sales packaging used for transporting goods. This is quite important. It needs to be confirmed in one of the secondary legislation, but it was already mentioned by the Commission in a workshop or webinar in December 2024. And that is it. I'm almost on time, I believe. And now I'm totally open to your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anik, for this valuable and, I must say, very condensed overview of this complex topic at such a dynamic moment in the EU regulatory process. So let's now move on to the questions that we have received from our audience. So let me check what got in. So here's a very good question. It's actually two questions in one. Who will determine the recyclability performance grading, and who will be responsible for taking care that the grading is made? The primary material producer, the converter, or the end user?
Yes, thank you for those good questions indeed. In terms of who will determine the performance grading methodology, the Commission always said, like, we mandate sent to develop the design for recycling guideline with the help of industry. This is a very technical document indeed, whereas GRC said we will, the Commission and ourselves, so the Joint Research Center, we will define the methodology for the grading systems. Now, more recently, GRC has invited CEN, the European standardization body, to contribute to the reflection as to the methodology for this grading system. As I mentioned earlier, this is critical because at the very end of the day, this is what will determine access to the market. If you do not reach these 70% and then in 2038, 80%, you are not supposed to put your packaging on the market. So we are all very keen to contribute to that reflection together with GRC, and Fiber Packaging Europe and its members will, of course, be involved in that process. As to compliance, it is not users. That would be very, very complicated to ensure, although users have the possibility always to address their member states in case of a non-compliant material. But in general, it's the packaging producers that will have to have a conformity assessment and conformity declaration to demonstrate indeed the compliance with the requirement. This being said, the market surveillance authorities and member states can check the compliance, and in that case, of course, request retrieval from the market in case of lack of compliance.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So, sorry, there's a second question. Do we expect any big changes as a result of the environmental omnibus?
Yes, I mean the environment omnibus and as well as the other omnibus, but also the single market strategy or the expected or upcoming Circular Economy Act, which will come in Q3 2026, do encompass I would say, the more recent political objectives of the Commission and the member states. And those can be summarized and are very much supported by industry. It's namely harmonization, simplification, and competitiveness. And I believe, especially in the present context of US tariff exports from China and other countries outside Europe, we do really need to take those high-level objectives into account. So to be specific on the environmental omnibus, and because industry very strongly call for a non-reopening of PPWR. It will address a number of issues, for example, batteries, waste of electric and electronic equipment. And with regard to packaging, it is focused only on the simplification of the registration for the EPR systems. So, if I want to summarize, the omnibus introduces a one-stop shop for producers to register their products, so they can basically register in one member state for all the member states, which was not the case before. So it will not change fundamentally the PPWR. The Circular Economy Act and the review of the Single-Use Plastic Directive may have more impact in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Annick. There was just a third question that came in, so maybe we still have the time to tackle that question as well. If PE content is less than 5% of the bag weight, will the 10% and 25% recycled content targets still apply and still be requested?
No. So the 5% is a threshold. So if you have less than 5%, less or up to 5% plastic in your packaging, you're exempted from this recycled content requirement. That was a quick answer, but clear, I hope.
Just in time for one last question then. I'm sorry, this will definitely be the last question. Will the paper has to be produced with recycled content or only the plastic part?
Only the plastic part. That is very, very clear. This being said, you can see also in one of my slides that the Commission, I believe in 2032, will review the quotas of recycled content in all materials. And if they believe, I mean, if I want to paraphrase, that the recycled content is not sufficient, they may adopt legislation or targets. The paper industry is not in favor of that for two main reasons, to be quick. One is that, as I mentioned, we have an 87% recycling rate already in 2024. So we believe that the recycling value chain for paper-based packaging is functioning well and does not need any artificial push or pull measures to have a certain use of recycled materials. The recycled fibers find their way into new products in the best economic and environmental manner, and there's no need for artificial rules to organize that. The second reason is that at the moment there is no possibility in most cases to use recycled content for food contact material. So that makes it particularly difficult for packaging, of course. There are some packaging which are not in food contact, but some of them, yes. So we are, as paper industry, not in favor of that. But the answer was no, of course.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Annick, again for your insights. And thank you also to the audience, of course, for the great questions. And just a quick reminder, so if we didn't get to your question or if you have questions afterwards, please feel free to email us at info@eurosac.org. We now move on to our second expert, Susanna Anderson is a project manager and regulatory specialist at Normpac, and she's working at the intersection of food contact safety and research. She advises companies on the legal assessment of food contact materials and provides training in these areas as well. She brings wide industry experience from the paper and board sector and holds a Master of Science in ecotoxicology. I'm sorry, this is really a hard word for me. Ecotoxicology. So she knows what she's talking about, and today she will discuss food contact safety. She will outline the new PPWR regulations on substances of concern, such as PFAS, and provide insights into the ongoing development of a new PFAS measurement methodology that is currently in the study phase. And in addition, she will also give you an overview of the recently updated food contact guidelines from Eurosac. Susanna, we're very happy to have you with us today, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here. It is a difficult word to say, ecotoxicology. I will, as Ingo said, focus on food contact materials. So we heard Annick talk about the PPWR, and I will try to explain the link between PPWR and to food contact regulations. And then I'll also talk a little bit on how we can measure PFAS in a cost-effective way. And I'll also introduce the updated guideline for food contact from Eurosac and CEPI Eurokraft. But of course, I will start off with a little bit of an introduction to food contact. So, food contact materials, or FCM, as we usually call them, is any material or product that is intended for food contact. You can think about this as any kitchen utensil, for example, a plate, maybe a bowl, a coffee mug, or similar. But it's also any material or product that is already in contact with food. And here is where we find packaging or maybe a paper sack. It's also the third category, which is any material or product that can reasonably be expected to come into contact with food. And this category is a little bit more different to define, but it could be, for example, a shelf in a fridge, or maybe a table where you might put your sandwich on it, and if you do, it becomes a food contact material. All these materials and products, they contain chemicals that can be transferred to the food. And when we then eat the food, we're exposed to the chemicals. Some of these chemicals might be more toxic than others. And this is why we do have a specific legislation for food contact materials. I will not go into details of this legislation, but I will talk a little bit about the major points in it. So we have on a European level, we have the Framework Regulation 1935-2004, and then we also have the Good Manufacturing Practice 2023-2006. These two regulations are applicable to any food contact materials, regardless of the material type. And the framework regulation, like the gist of it, is that food contact materials must not transfer its constituents to food in quantities that can endanger human health. It does not define how to comply with this. It just tells you that the food contact material cannot endanger human health. The idea is that the specifics on how to comply with this is to be defined in material-specific legislation. As of today, we have some material-specific legislations for some material types, but not all. The most common one is the plastics regulation. It defines specifics for plastic materials, and it's on the European level. For paper and board, for example, there is no material-specific legislation on a European level. Instead, we look at national legislations or recommendations. And it's very common to refer to the BFR recommendation, the German BFR recommendation, BFR 36. What these have in common is that they use a positive list approach. This means that every chemical that you use in the production of a plastic or a paper needs to be evaluated and authorized and listed on the positive lists of these two texts. And then both of them also defines analyses that are required to do on the final material. Now, one might think that if you comply with these positive lists, you avoid all substances of concern. Unfortunately, that is not true. Because on these positive lists, we do find some substances of concern. It's a very slow process to delist substances, and it rarely happens, to be honest. And this is why we sometimes find substances of concern on the positive lists. So in order to avoid substances of concern, you also need to consider other legislations as well. And these are just two examples. So you might have to consider the substances of very high concern list below the REACH legislation, and also persistent organic pollutants, for example. There are also other legislations that you might need to consider. One thing that to keep in mind here, though, is that a ban of a substance overrules an authorization of the same substance in the food contact material legislation. So say, for example, that you use a chemical that is listed on the positive list in the plastics regulation, for example. You for sure comply with the food contact legislation, with the plastics regulation. But if it is banned according to the persistent organic pollutants regulation, then the product does not comply with the POPs regulation and you cannot put the product on the market. This is why I say that a ban overrules. This is an example of how legislations sometimes are contradictory to each other, but we also see examples where legislations overlap. So we heard Anik talk about the PPWR, and this overlaps with the food contact legislation. So we do have food contact materials. Some of those materials are packaging. And then we have packaging. Some of these packaging are food packaging. So here's where we see the overlap. And in the PPWR, there's actually one requirement that targets food packaging. And that is Article 5.5 that says that from the 12th of August 2026, food contact packaging shall not be placed on the market if it contains per- and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFAS as we usually call them, in a concentration equal to or above the following limit values: 25 ppb for any individual PFAS when it's measured with targeted analysis, 250 ppb for the sum of PFAS when it's measured with targeted analysis as well, and 50 ppm for total PFAS. And here we include the polymeric PFAS, and this is measured or can be measured with total fluorine. And what's important here is that I said equal to or above the following limit values. I did not say one of the following limit values. So that means you have to comply with all three of these limits. Now, if you have a material where you do not intentionally add PFAS, it's very expensive and time consuming to do all these three analysis for all these three. So there is an ongoing discussion how to approach these limits, if you need to do analysis for all three of them or not. RISE has been working on a workflow for testing PFAS for quite some time. In 2024, this article was published, and it gives a systematic workflow for PFAS testing. And it's applicable to any product, regardless of the material type. It starts off with measuring total fluorine in step 1 here. If you do have a total fluorine result below 50 ppm, you go and look at the targeted analysis, so individual PFAS. If you do have a result of total fluorine that is above 50 ppm, then you need to check whether it is PFAS or not, and this can be done by pyrolysis. If it is confirmed that it is PFAS above 50 ppm, then the product or material is non-compliant with these limits. If you confirm that it is not PFAS, you go and look at the targeted screening. So, in my view, the question here is: do we need to do all of these steps to be compliant? My sort of argument would be that total fluorine should be enough, because if you see a result that is above 50 ppm and you confirm that it's PFAS, you're already non-compliant. And if you have a total fluorine below 50 ppm and you do not add PFAS intentionally, this should be enough to show compliance. Now, I'm not an expert on these specific methods, but if you want to know more about this workflow, you can read this article or let me know, and I can put you in contact with our experts for these. And the same colleagues has recently done a case study on PFAS. They looked at 103 samples from 44 different stakeholders. The samples included virgin and recycled fiber and also plastic. 101 of these samples were compliant with all three concentration limits in PPWR. So when they saw a result for total fluorine that was under 50 ppm, the result for individual and sum of PFAS was also compliant with the limits. For two samples, the total fluorine showed results above 50 ppm. PFAS was confirmed, and the other two limits for targeted PFAS was also above the limit. So this supports the proposal that if you see total fluorine below 50 ppm, it is likely sufficient to demonstrate that no PFAS was used, and also compliance with the limits. We don't know how this will pan out, but this is our suggestion. A total fluorine should be the first step to analyze PFAS. We don't know when we will have any feedback on that, hopefully during the spring, but we'll have to wait and see. And now I'm going to move on to the introduction of the guideline for food contact, published at CEPI, Eurokraft, and Eurosac. And this food contact guideline is aimed at supporting paper sack manufacturers to meet the requirements of the FCM legislation. And it is targeted to the European market. So FDA, European or American legislation, and Chinese legislation, for example, are not within the scope. And the guide starts off with giving an overview of the legislative framework for food contact materials, and it's focused on paper sacks. So it describes the plastics regulation, for example. It describes the BFR recommendation for paper and paperboard. It also talks about adhesives and printing inks that are usually used in paper sack production. It also introduces the ESG Key 7 Steps to Food Compliance, which is a stepwise approach easily explained on how to actually evaluate a food contact material. ESG usually stands for European Paper Sack Research Group, but here in the ESG Key 7 Steps, E stands for Establish Background Prerequisites, and that's what you start off with when you evaluate a food contact material. This means that you need to define the conditions of use. You define what kind of food will be in contact with the material, during how long will the contact be, and at what temperature. After that, you specify the sack construction and applicable legislations. So you define what kind of material types are used in the product: paper, plastic, adhesives, printing ink, for example. And you also define which legislations are applicable to those materials. After that, it's time to generate the compliance. This is where you collect supporting documentation from suppliers. Based on that, and based on your defined conditions of use, you perform analyses that are needed. And based on all of those results, you generate your own statement. So this was a really micro crash course on how to evaluate a food contact material. If you want to learn more about it, you can read it in the guideline, which is published on the CEPI, Eurokraft, and Eurosac webpage. And the latest version of the guideline is basically an alignment with updates of the legislations. So it's a new German ordinance for printing inks is included in the guide. Updates to the plastics regulation is aligned in the guideline, mainly the requirement for migration testing when you have a plastic layer on a paper sack. And also alignment with new requirements for recycled plastics. The requirements are not really new, that's why they're in quotations, but they're now aligned in the guideline. And also some new bans that are included now in the guide. Ban of bisphenols and ban of PFAS, as we already talked about. As a few short take-home messages from me, food contact material must not transfer their constituents to food in harmful amounts. And this is done by only using evaluated and authorized substances in the production. There are overlapping legislations. So when you evaluate a material or product, you usually need to look at several legislations to be fully compliant. The ban on PFAS in food packaging will come into effect on the 12th of August 2026. And as a support, when you evaluate your food contact material, you have the ESG food contact guideline that gives a stepwise approach on how to evaluate the material. And that was all for me. Thank you very much for listening in, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you, Susanna, for this thorough and highly relevant overview. Yes, we got a question from the audience. It's a rather long question. So here it is. What about plastic materials delivered at a packaging producer warehouse before August 12, 2026 that contains PFAS as process additives? They can be used for manufacturing of packaging since they were put in the market before the deadline. So where's the reference in the EU regulation for this?
Ooh, you're putting me on the spot here, because that would be the translational periods for the PPWR, which I am not the expert on. Maybe Annick could help me with that one, because I'm not sure how it is written. Usually, if it's put on the market before the date, it can last on the market until it's your storage is running out. But I'm not sure actually on this one.
So,
Yeah,
Annick, can you help us out on that?
very quickly, because I see time is short now. But yes, indeed, if it's on the market, it can stay on the market. Discussion is ongoing for the stocks exhaustion. So that is still not very clear because not addressed directly in the Article 5.5. So there's discussion around that, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Annick, for
Perfect.
that.
Yes, thank you, Annick, and thank you, Susanna, for providing clarity on this in a complex regulatory landscape. So we will move on now to the next topic. But as you already said, for those who would like to explore the updated food contact guidelines in more detail, you can find them on the Eurosac website in the media section. So there's a media section under Eurosac publications at eurosac.org. So it's time for our final speaker today. So please welcome Martina Friedl. Martina is a life cycle assessment expert at RISE, where she works on environmental assessments, sustainability strategy, and research in the field of sustainable materials and packaging. And with her background in environmental engineering and sustainability consulting, she supports the European PaperSec research group on topics such as PaperSec recyclability, the Net Zero Roadmap, and the initiative Construction Goes Circular. Today, she will cover the new recyclability assessments featured in the updated white paper, which is called Why Recycling Paper Sacks Makes Sense, and discuss how to maximize paper sack recyclability. She will also share the latest developments in European recycling initiatives, especially Construction Goes Circular. So, Martina, we are thrilled to have you with us today, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you for this lovely introduction, Ingo. Happy to be here as well, and happy to be speaking about the paper sack recyclability and recycling projects. So, to jump straight into my presentation, I would like to circle back to a very comprehensive overview of the PPWR given by Annick, and just highlight again the legal requirements related to the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, Article 6 on recyclable packaging. This really sets the tone for today's presentation, as we know that the packaging will need to be designed for material recycling, it will need to be collected and sorted, and it will need to be recycled at scale. So for my presentation, my idea is to frame this around two questions, really. The first one, how do we assess if paper sacks are recyclable? And the second one, how do we ensure that paper sacks get recycled at end of life? To make a long story short, I can just lead with my headline here. Recyclability testing confirms that paper sacks are indeed recyclable. So Eurosac and CEPI Eurokraft commissioned an independent study with the objective to demonstrate that paper sacks are recyclable in a conventional recycling process. This testing was done according to the standardized testing method, so the CEPI recyclability test method and the Forever Green recyclability evaluation protocol. So these testing methods essentially take a range of metrics, and then the evaluation protocol translates them into a single score related to a material's recyclability in a conventional recycling process. In this study, we had 6 different paper sacks tested. And out of those 6, the 5 basic constructions included represent over 80% of the paper sacks on the market. The 6th sack was actually a used paper sack, a used cement sack, so it was also a very interesting addition to the study to assess for recyclability. The outcomes of this study confirm that 5 out of the 6 samples were demonstrated to be recyclable with a conventional process. And that is great news, as it gives the paper sack producers and converters the confidence to actually engage with the recyclability question in a new way. As you'll see, one of the samples was not deemed to be recyclable in a conventional process. That was a milk powder bag. But there actually what was tested was a worst case scenario, as this paper sack included a plastic tube, which is actually designed to be separated from the paper component before entering the recycling process. And finally, what's important to highlight here is that the used cement sack that was tested, actually, there it was shown that small quantities of cement residue did not impact the recyclability of the used cement sack. More information on this can be found in the updated publication, Why Recycling Paper Sacks Make Sense. And to add on top of that, and to show that it really makes sense indeed, is also a note that including paper sacks in the recycling stream creates multiple benefits. So the second part of the study also assessed how inclusion of paper sacks affects the performance of the recycling output. So there, a fully recycled liner was used as a reference, and the performance indicators on a fiber level, on a pulp level, and on a paper handsheet were compared. What was shown there is that the substitution of recycled fiber with sack kraft fiber resulted in increases to tear, burst, and tensile indices, increased pulp drainage rate, and a reduction in ash content. So to translate this into something that's more meaningful for you in practice, is that recycling paper sacks can make paper sheets stronger, it can increase the fiber yield in the recycling process, and it can also reduce the energy needed for drying the paper, which is of course very advantageous for paper mills producing recycled paper. Now, moving on, how can we maximize paper sack recyclability? In the Design for Recyclability Guidelines, published by Eurosac and CEPI Eurokraft, the best practices for good recyclability are outlined, and this is something that producers and converters can keep in mind when designing their packaging. So some of the most important measures to consider here is to optimize the use of barrier films. So here, considering free films with a low material density or lower material density than paper, would be suitable, considering lamination with water-soluble adhesives, and barrier coatings on the inside of the packaging is recommended to facilitate the sorting process. Another thing that can be considered here is to minimize certain types of adhesives. So for example, PAE and hot melt and pressure-sensitive adhesives. Additionally, minimizing unintended product residue is an important point, and of course, designing for separability of multiple components is advantageous because this enables even more complex constructions to be recycled in individual streams. Here, it's also important to note that many novel materials have not yet been assessed for recyclability. So here we can often speak about bio-based films and coatings. So here, further testing is required to prove compatibility with conventional or specialized recycling processes. And finally, the labeling and communication part. So, of course, the design of recyclability is only as good as what then actually happens in practice with it. So here, labeling the packaging properly on what is the designed end of its life management strategy, and communication to that to its users, to recyclers, is very important. So that was the first part of the question, and now moving to the second question: how do we ensure that paper sacks get recycled at end of life? You've heard about factual evidence bases for why paper sacks are recyclable and how to maximize their recyclability. But now we're coming to the really tough part. So how to actually get to this in practice? And the problem statement here is quite obvious. Though theoretically recyclable, paper sacks often do not get recycled in practice. What the European Paper Sack Research Group has been focused on for the past couple of years was the initiative Construction Go Circular. So as many of you will know, as we have been very proud to highlight this in the past, is that this initiative initially started as Paper Sacks Go Circular, and was then expanded to the entire construction industry to reflect the identified synergies and common needs for improving the circularity of construction materials. So there, some issues or some challenges on what is needed in practice were identified. And simply put, what we need are collection systems at construction sites. It's education on sorting and emptying of the materials so that they are suitable to enter the recycling process. We need logistics to sorting and recycling facilities. And of course, we also need economically viable end uses of recycled material for the whole story to make sense. Overall, we need to connect the key actors in the value chain to recognize the material's value and its contribution to a more circular economy. And this is kind of the fun part of this assignment, right? Finding the right stakeholders, connecting them, finding those synergies, and then making something meaningful out of this. And here we are very happy to report that this Construction Go Circular initiative in Spain is now being formalized into an independent association. What's more is that initial funding from the founding organizations has been secured, and these include producers of construction materials, construction companies, waste management companies, extended producer responsibility organizations, and of course also material associations, including Eurosac and CEPI Eurokraft as the founding members. This is really a great example of the paper sack industry spearheading the development in circular economy, and we're really excited to have so many passionate people on board who have this vision and are ready to implement it in practice. In parallel, work on paper sack recyclability is ongoing also in Italy and Austria, and it's our hope that by the time the next year's webinar rolls around, we will have some excellent updates to share with you there as well. For any stakeholders interested, they can get more information on possibilities for collaboration through Eurosac, so do not hesitate to send us an email. Of course, the Construction Go Circular is not the full story of the paper sack recycling. So here we also wanted to highlight that paper sack recycling is relevant for other sectors as well. As we know, we have significant shares of paper sacks also in the food products, especially milk powder sectors, and of course the animal feed, seeds, chemical products, and so on. So here's another two established initiatives in Europe that are worth highlighting. So the first one is from Germany, Repasac, who enable collection and recycling systems for paper sacks from a range of industries with over 350 depots nationally to ease the collection and make it as accessible to companies as possible. And then we also have Adivalor in France, who enabled the collection and recycling system for agricultural waste. So here we're really talking about the paper sacks for seeds or animal feed. Finally, we are also looking beyond the paper and board industry, because there is an increasing amount of material recycling options that are gaining interest in other industries. So for example, what is also interesting to explore further is the integration of recycled paper and board fiber in construction products. So here it could be fiberboard, plasterboard, insulation, furniture, and more. And here we're really welcoming novel developments and new ideas that could contribute to the landscape of the circular economy solutions. So, in summary, we've touched on how do we assess if paper sacks are recyclable, and here we know there exist standardized testing protocols which show that they are indeed recyclable and even beneficial to include in the recycling stream. Plus, the recyclability guidelines inform and give guidance on how to design smart packaging to maximize their recyclability. Finally, we've discussed how do we ensure that paper sacks get recycled at end of life, and shown that there are ongoing initiatives that demonstrate the possibilities for paper sack recycling in a wider industrial context, even beyond the paper and board industry. That is all from me today. Thank you very much. My email is listed here. And now I'll hand it over to Ingo for some follow-up questions.
Thank you very much, Martina, for this inspiring presentation on such an important industry topic. We're running a little short of time, but we have time for one question, of course. So the question is, are there any misconceptions in the industry about what makes a paper sack recyclable?
A good one. Yes, I guess there do indeed exist misconceptions, both on the design components of paper sacks. So here, occasionally we will hear concerns about the paper films and also about the product residue concerns. So especially when talking about hazardous materials. What is important to highlight here is that these issues are not exclusive to the paper sacks and are indeed a sign of the circular economy development, where more and more complex materials will need to be included in the circulation, in the valorization process, and we will need to figure out how to resolve any of these concerns. I think that the recyclability study shows that a lot of these concerns are in the first place unfounded and that paper sacks can be recycled in a conventional recycling stream, but then the recyclability, paper sack recyclability initiatives also show that there is indeed an interest from the industry to make this more scalable at a faster pace in a broader industry and bring it, make it accessible across Europe.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Martina, for the answer and for these valuable insights. So we have to move on. Thank you very much. Once again, for your information that if we didn't get to your question today, please feel free to email us at info@eurosac.org, and we'll gladly get back to you afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us now to the end of today's webinar, and I would like to bring our experts back on screen as we move into our closing round. So I would like to say a big thank you to Annick, to Susanna, and to Martina for sharing your expertise and insights. It was really wonderful having you here today. So thank you for making this webinar so valuable. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the webinar is recorded, and the recording will soon be available on eurosac.org and also on the Eurosac YouTube channel, where you can also find other very useful information and material. So on behalf of Eurosac and CEPI Eurokraft, thank you for participating. Stay connected with us for updates, for example, through the Eurosac or CEPI Eurokraft LinkedIn channels. We look forward to welcoming you again, whether online or in person. And until then, have a wonderful holiday season. Take care and goodbye.